The history of technology and how it's changed the business goes back a long way, doesn't it?
It goes back a long ways. The idea when Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1455, that thing stayed pretty static for several centuries, and so people were making newspapers in the same way for a long time. And then when we got into the 1820s, people figured out a way to add steam to it. And when you could add steam to the idea of driving a press, then instead of doing about 250 papers an hour, then you were up to 1,000 papers an hour, then you're up to 20,000 pages an hour, then you're up to 30,000 pages. So that greatly changed the ability of newspapers to be disseminated within the public. And that's kind of an amazing thing. One of the things that went along with that is newspaper originally was made out of cloth. So old papers basically look the same as they did. I have 300-year-old papers that look like there could be today's papers. And so one of the things that happened when they got faster, they also made papers larger. So you ended up, instead of having a paper that was, say, the size of a normal paper today, you might have pages that were up to 3 feet by 5 feet, filled with type that looks like the on the sports page, the scores and things, agate size type. So it was really small, so you could literally get an amazing amount of information in there. So these technological changes change the idea of how we disseminate information into society. But I think one of the really fascinating parts of this whole thing is how when new technology was invented and came into being, how it threatened the status quo. So for example, in 1845, with the year after the telegraph was invented, newspaper editors began to write editorials about the demise of the newspaper, that the newspaper was going to go away because the telegraph was going to supplant the newspapers because it could move information so much faster. And that's true, but what it really did instead, it enhanced the newspapers, because the telegraph could take news from point A to point B, but it couldn't take it that last mile from the telegraph office into people's homes or into taverns or into coffee shops or into hotels and things like that. And so that's where the newspaper took over, and so then the telegraph made the newspaper an even more stronger kind of entity within American society.
Sounds familiar to a lot of what we've heard over the last couple of decades and even today.
It does.
From the telegraph to Twitter, I kind of want to ask you a question about technology today. I mean, even as an example that we saw on campus here within the last couple of weeks when the university announced its impending move to the Colonial Athletic Association.
Right.
So many folks who were there in that news conference were busy looking down at their phones, tweeting out details more than they were looking up at President Lambert and Dave Blank and those who were speaking. So how do you teach students to use the technology that's available today, and while they're doing all that and looking at what they're doing immediately, not missing maybe some of the details?
Well, it becomes really, really difficult not to miss the details when you're doing these kinds of things. One of the things you do teach students when you're teaching them news writing and things like that is in a good interviewing process, you ask questions that you want answers to, but you also follow those with questions you really don't care about the answers to so much, and you can, yeah, wow, that's great, it's wonderful, while you're writing the first things down. It becomes a little more difficult, I think, when you're not controlling the questions and answers, but you're listening and you're trying to tweet out things. It becomes a little more difficult. So I'm not really sure how we can figure that out and make it work. One of the things that we do with students is, they're pretty adept at all this technology anyway. So one of the things that you do is you teach how to write in multiple ways. You teach how to write for different platforms. And so one of the good things about Twitter is it's not that different from writing a really good headline. If you can write a good headline that's got some good information, that makes people read, that provides enough so people know something. So, good headlines, if you can read a page of good headlines, you're not totally without any knowledge on subjects. And so that's part of how all of this works. But again, it's just using the technology that's available to disseminate information in the ways that you can reach people. And so that's just kind of the way it's always worked. Will it always be a piece of paper? Probably doubtful, just because of natural resources, but it's the same kind of information when you're doing it, no matter what. It's just your presentation method. You have to understand the method and get some information into that specific size or specific kind of the technology that you're using.
So looking at technology like that in the same context as we do the telegraph, threatening newspapers
Right.
back then, is there a similar threat today?
I think that the threat to newspapers principally comes, at least in my estimation, from the ability to make money as print media outlets used to. You know, print media used to have a huge profit margin, 30% or more. When that begins to shrink, then people begin to worry. So I think that I think there are certain markets that could be potentially in trouble. I think the really large national markets are going to always probably be safe to a certain extent. And then I think smaller markets that are not going to be served, except for if they have a particular media outlet like a newspaper in Burlington or many of the cities in eastern North Carolina, they'll probably be all right. But the middle-sized papers that try to cover lots, I think that there's a potential for them to be in trouble in the next 20 years.
Given that outlook and given everything that reporters have at their fingertips these days and all the different responsibilities they all face now, how do you teach students to be sound journalists with all the different things that they have to work on?
It really is difficult in some instances because not only it used to be you could go out with a reporter's notebook if you were a newspaper writer, but today you're going to go out with a notebook, with a recorder, with a video. You have to shoot video, you have to do all these things, so you have to set it all up, and it works the same way whether you're a print outlet or whether you're a broadcast outlet. You have to do the whole kind of thing. So what you have to do, I think, to educate students is you have to make sure that they understand how to use these and what the tools do. One of the big things about all news and everything that we do in this industry is it's storytelling at the bottom. And so you have to know which media, which one does the best job of telling the story and which one will give the best information to people. And so knowing which of these to use or how to use them all and which part to tell the best story. So part of, I think, our job as educators is to make sure our students are aware of that, aware that the bottom line is a good story to be told, of good factual information, of things that will make people want to read, people want to watch, people want to listen. And then you have to make sure that they're at least competent with those tools. And so what happens is now it's not just, can I write a good lead? It's, can I grab a really nice visual to go with a good lead, to go with a great soundbite? And it becomes difficult. So it just becomes more work for students in that case.
Has all that changed what you teach and how you teach?
I think it's changed it a little bit. I don't think it's changed it so much because I think one of the things that you'll constantly hear when you talk to people is the bottom line is you have to be a good writer and you have to be a good storyteller. So you have to be able to understand that. So what we do at Elon is we teach students within a basic writing course that all students take, those basic fundamentals of how to put that thing together, how to make that story work, how to make it concise, how to be accurate, how to grab attention. And then as that process goes on, you add in those other tools to make it work. And then you try to learn what's the difference in telling a story that's going to be seen in print versus what's going to be different in the story that you see that someone's going to watch and listen to. And how do you make those things work? How do they do? And that's the trick. And so that's what's happening all over.
So the fundamentals of what was sound journalism 10 years ago or 100 years ago is still the same.
I think it is. I think there's some changes, trying to figure out what to do with the tweet. If you're going to blog, what are you going to do? What's going to be the value of those entities? But I think the basics of sound good journalism pretty much remain the same.
Hanging this on a current event, the Chicago Sun-Times has given us a lot to think about, and reporters there a lot more to do as far as taking photos with their iPhones now while they're out reporting and getting rid of their photo staff. Is it possible for journalists to do it all effectively?
That's a really great question because I'm not sure that we can do it all well. We talk about being great multitaskers, and especially younger people being great multitaskers. But if you're concentrating on one thing, it becomes really difficult to be doing another thing. And so I think that, Yeah, you can probably take some decent pictures with an iPhone. If you believe the commercials, more photographs are taken on an iPhone every day than on any other kind of camera. So yeah, you can do it. The question is, can you get the right shot? One of the things that I used to really enjoy when I was teaching editing a lot was looking at, and when we would do the photo section, because you would look at a lot of things where photographers would say, I waited 6 hours, 8 hours to catch the right shot. Well, you can't wait 6 hours or 8 hours with an iPhone to catch the right shot when you have to write the story, when you have to, upload the story, when you have to do these kinds of things. So I think ultimately something's going to be lost, but I'm not sure in society that we will notice it so much, because I think we've become so accustomed to that kind of photograph, that kind of information. We may not, although, a great photograph is a marvelous thing.
Absolutely, without question. Now, is it possible to do it all ethically as well, without cutting corners in some sort of ethos?
I don't know if it's possible to do this and not cut some corners. I don't know whether the ethical issue would be a part of it, but I'm not sure that you can get it all done. I just know how hard it is, or how hard it was, especially in a really serious situation. Say, for example, you're covering a regional agency that has been accused of some kind of malfeasance. Maybe funds are being diverted to a certain place, and so now I've got to make sure I've got the exact quotes of what somebody said. I can record it and go back on it, and I've got to get a photograph, I've got to do all that. But it becomes really difficult, I think, at that point, to do it all and do it properly.
So looking at history, are there some comparable examples of how technology has changed how reporters report the news?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of examples. The telegraph would be one example, how we changed reporting to news. In the Civil War, James Gordon Bennett sent probably more reporters into the field than nearly all other papers combined. He sent with them a team of telegraphers who simply fed the news back as quickly as it could possibly be done. So that's a great example of that. The telephone changed the way reporting was done, because you could now phone it in, right? Radio actually changed it too. Radio, when it was initially created, wasn't thought of as broadcast. It was point to point. It was like a mobile phone. It was just wireless, so you were sending a message at first with a telegraph key from point A to point B. So one of the things that would actually happen that I think is really fascinating is in the late 19th and early 20th century, they would actually take radio and they would send information from land to ships. And then they had a printing press on the ship, and they took that and they just used that information from the radio, from the wireless that was sent to them. They would print a newspaper on the ship for all those wealthy patrons who were on the luxury voyage, so they would have a newspaper. So it's kind of amazing. Motion pictures, the very same thing. Initially when motion pictures came out, one of the things that happened is we started newsreel companies. So from the very earliest, even in the 1920s, you could go to the motion pictures, and before the movie started, you could watch a newsreel that would encapsulate the news of the week. For example, the Scopes trial. You could see it in the theaters. The Bruno Hauptmann trial for the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's son. You could watch it. They even did that so that they had two versions of it when the trial came to an end. One that he was guilty, one he was not guilty. They were just to show the correct one. So that's just another example of how the technology changed it. And then of course radio, when it became a broadcast medium in the 1920s, at the end of the century, it changed things. In 1928, Herbert Hoover campaigned for president almost exclusively via the radio. Didn't have to travel anymore, he could reach everybody's home. The stock market crash, live on the radio. And then of course when we move into the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt figured out it's the perfect way to reach everybody's home. So that's just ways that radio technology changed things. We heard the Hindenburg crash live on radio. So there's all kinds of ways that these things changed, the technology changed. And of course then, you know, television's going to kind of do the same thing. It's going to take it a while to do it because we didn't, at first everything basically had to be recorded like the old 35 millimeter film, had to be developed. And then, so it took at least 30 to 45 minutes of anything that was shot outside the studio to be shown. But by the time we get to the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, we figured out how to do things live. And there's some amazing things with the Kennedy assassination that we see that television didn't even understand its own technology or how any of it worked, but it figured it out within that 4-day weekend of how to make it work. So the technology is always changing things, and that's what we saw when we got to the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, how online is able to change things, how addition of social media has given us the opportunity for everybody to be a reporter, but which is really kind of ironic if you want to look at it in the scheme of the whole history of things, because in 1690 America's first newspaper, Public Occurrences, was released. There was only one issue. After that it was banned by the Massachusetts government because it was believed to be problematic. But Benjamin Harris, the guy who put the paper out, was probably the most forward-thinking guy of a long time. So, you know, the typical paper of that time period was one sheet that was folded, so you had a front page, 2 insides, and a back page. Well, what Harris did for the initial Public Occurrences was he left the back page blank with instructions that those who had the paper, read it, were then to either comment on the news that was in the paper or write new news down on the back page and then pass it on. Very 21st century, right? Yet it was 1690. So that's just kind of the way. The more things change, even though the technology has changed, the method of the idea of it, at least from that point, has been the same.
Well, hanging on that idea of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Of course, in the interactive media program, your students are looking at what's now and what's next. But how important is it for them to have a great grasp on the history?
Well, you know, in the interactive media program, we don't deal so much in history. We deal a lot in law. We deal a lot of theory. We deal a lot in usability. But, you know, I think that ultimately there's an important part for history to play even in that, because even though we're looking at kind of short-term history there, you know, this is what it used to be 10 years ago, and this is now. I personally think there probably should be some more. But, you know, in our interactive media program, we're talking about 10 months, 36 hours. There's a lot to push in there. So we're dealing more with the technology. And actually we're dealing with how to tell a good story, how to reach people, what makes it work, what makes an audience tick, what's the best platform to use, how do people react on the platform.
Is there anything you see as new or next that could usher in the next change?
Well, you know, it's really interesting because who knows what's going to happen. I had a student this semester who predicted that by 2020, Facebook would be no longer in existence as far as what people are using, which is kind of amazing when you think about how many use it. But his ideas were based on a lot of different things, which is how quickly things happen, how quickly MySpace came into being and has disappeared, how new things come along and catch on. And so the idea is that we don't even know what's there or what's going to be developed next. In the world of interactivity, a great example of how something seemed to be absolutely essential and was going to be the foundation of interactive media would be the program called Flash, if you're familiar with Flash. And so Flash is a program that when we started the interactive media program 4 years ago was actually the foundational component, because Flash was what was used to make all the good animation, all these kind of, you know, all the things that made it really neat. Well, then what does Apple do? Apple introduces the iPad and all, which does not support Flash. And so we're at the point now where next year, if we teach Flash, it'll probably be in just a few weeks or maybe even just in an elective course, where up to this point it's been an entire course that people have spent. So that's not, that in a way that's technology, but you know, things change quickly. So I think predicting what is going to happen is, you know, pretty tough.
A risky proposition.
Yeah, at best.
In addition to teaching, you're a prolific writer, have written a number of different publications and chapters. You've taken a look at free press and media history. Give us an idea of the scope of your body of work and perhaps what's coming down the pike for you.
Well, you know, I started working in this area in media history when I was in graduate school, and I went with the idea of doing religion in media. But I grew up in a small colonial town, Edenton, so I was very, very interested in the colonial period, and so I started working on that. So I've done a lot of work with colonial newspapers, especially looking at not the political news that's in them, but the other kinds of news. The news about crime, the news about slaves, about women, about just the kinds of things that interest everyday people. And that just seemed to me to be something that nobody had dealt with a lot. So then I've done a lot of work in that area. You mentioned the free press. What I did with that is I started looking at how from the time of, say, from the late Renaissance into the Enlightenment, how the ideas of Western thought kind of created this idea of democracy and the idea that a free press is essential to it. And so with that, I kind of traced it from there up to about the time that we created the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, just to see how things went. And there, you know, there's this slow development of give and take, give and take, give and take. But in America especially, there was a lot more give than take. After about 1735 and the trial of John Peter Zenger for libel, after that point, basically, it was very difficult to control printers and what printers said and what people printed in papers. And so basically what happened is most governments in America, most colonial governments just kind of gave up. And it was kind of free reign. And that's how when you get to the time of the American Revolution that basically you could slander the government, you could do whatever, and it just kept on going like that. One of the I've done some work too all the way up through the Civil War, but one of the books that I did is called The Active Voice, which is the media's role in defining the nation. So what I wanted to do with that is I just wanted to show that how integral media have been, and are to the shaping of what happens in this country. And that is, I think, is really, really important, because it's really hard to separate a lot of events that have happened in America's past with their presentation in media. Because let's be honest, almost everything that we learn, other than some basic kind of stuff in life, we pick up through some medium, be it a book, be it radio, be it television, be it newspapers, be it magazines. We kind of pick up our information from these sources. And so what I wanted to show is that the media aren't really, even though we claim today we're looking for an impartial and objective kind of press, that media have not really always, they've been actively involved in presenting information, in pushing different issues and causes. And so to me that was just kind of an important way I could kind of pull together 20 years of studying all this stuff and teaching media history and all the things that I kind of discovered and all, and put it together. So that's just something that I've enjoyed and worked on.
Kind of putting a button on all of it then. Yeah. How does today's technology and the fact that everybody can have a voice impact the freedom of the press?
Well, I think it can impact the freedom of the press in some ways. One of the things that happens is when you have so many voices, it's really almost impossible to control the voices. But I think government can probably control the technology. And if you control the technology, then you can actually control the voices. So if you make it, if you put certain impediments on the internet and on online usage, then you can control that. But that's one of the things that I find really interesting about because I mentioned to you public occurrences. Did something with CBS Morning News a few years back, and that was the idea of looking at it, that how if we look at the time span of American history and we look at it through media and media history, if we go back to the very earliest of times with public occurrences and those ideas, it's very, very similar to today, okay? In the middle of all of this, when media got huge, the days of the Pulitzers, the days of the Hearst, the days of the large conglomerates of media, then the voices of the people were taken out of it, right? Because they're so huge. I mean, you can't, the ordinary person can't just have a voice on television at any time she or he would like it, okay? But with the internet, one can. One can start any kind of online sharing device that you want to, blogs, whatever you want to call it, doing, with tweets, whatever, and all of a sudden you can literally reach tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. And that was the idea in the 1690s, in the early period. Yeah, we weren't printing, they might have only been printing 300 newspapers. But several things happened. Number one, the average newspaper ended up 20 to 25 miles from where it was printed. Okay? A study was done in New Hampshire that every single newspaper was looked at by 22 to 25 different people. Okay? So all of a sudden you have 300 newspapers, you multiply that by those numbers. The other thing was this was an oral society. They read things out loud. So the newspapers were read out loud at home to everybody in the homes. They were read on the streets. They were read in coffee houses. They were read in taverns. They were read everywhere. And anybody who could hear, didn't matter if you were literate or not, had access to it. On the internet today, if you have to read, you still have to read. Most of us are literate, but we can still do things in an oral way so it can be heard. So I think that the middle part of this, when we got huge, it took the people out. I think early on to now, very, very similar. The pamphleteers, all those people, if you can get somebody to print it. That's how I got into this whole field, because I was studying a guy named Benjamin Keach, who was the leader of the Baptists in the second half of the 17th century in England. And he created his whole argument, his whole fight against the Church of England, against everything, through pamphlets and letters to editors and newspapers. And I thought, holy cow, this is an amazing kind of thing, that this one guy who is a dissenter, who is somebody that nobody would ever know, is writing to these newspapers, and big wigs in the Anglican Church are arguing with this one little guy. And so it shows you the power of what the press can do, and that's what's happening again today. The danger, of course, in all of this is when you and I are just, and everybody's putting in information, how do we know whether it's accurate? How do we know whether the information sources are reliable? That's one of the things we've come to appreciate with a professional journalistic corps. But at least it's supposed to be. We've had problems, with different elements of it. But for the most part, that's been the good part of it. So I think that's what you see with everybody being a journalist. It's a great idea theoretically. You just have to be able to weed through it. And that's the thing that we had to do for many, many years. We had to weed through it. How do you know which is true, which is not true? And the problems that we had then and now are we tend to listen to the voices to which we agree. Okay? As long as we listen to the voices to which we agree, we're going to like what we hear, and we tend to turn off the ones we don't. And so maybe the possibility of getting a truly balanced look in this world of all voices becomes difficult for us because we don't want to take the time to listen.